The wind screamed across the open plains, carrying with it the sting of ice and the silent cries of a land that had seen too much suffering. Snow lay thick over the fields, erasing every trace of life except for the deep, uneven tracks that led to a splintered fence. There, in the bitter grip of winter, sat a young woman half buried in the snow. Her white dress clung to her body, soaked through and stained with mud and blood, the fabric torn and frozen stiff against her frame. Around her lay 3 newborn babies, their tiny fists trembling against the cold, their fragile cries growing weaker with each passing moment. Rope bound the woman to a fence post, cutting cruelly into her skin and leaving deep red welts along her arms. Her face was a portrait of exhaustion and fear, but beyond that, there was a haunting resignation in her eyes, a quiet acceptance that this frozen field might very well become her final resting place. From somewhere in the distance, the crunch of boots broke the suffocating silence, drawing closer through the swirling curtain of snow until a lone figure emerged, a rancher, his face weathered by years of solitude, his heavy coat crusted with frost, and his eyes locked on her with something far stronger than pity, determination. Her name was Elisa, though in the small, hard-hearted town she came from, she had been reduced to nothing more than whispers and scorn. To them, she was that girl who bore nothing but daughters, as if her only worth was measured by the children she could give. Her life had never been easy, even before she married. Born into poverty, she grew up in a family that constantly struggled to put food on the table. In those years, her only dream was simple: to have a home of her own and the safety of someone who would care for her. That dream seemed to take shape when she met Thomas, a man with a patch of land and the promise of security. To Elisa, he represented a chance at stability, a chance at the life she had always yearned for. But Thomas was not the man she thought him to be. He carried within him the bitterness of generations, the kind of resentment that hardens a heart long before cruelty ever shows itself. What he wanted more than anything was a son, an heir to carry his name, to work the land, to prove his worth in the eyes of men like himself. When Elisa bore her first daughter, Thomas had grown cold, withdrawing any tenderness he might have once shown. When the second daughter came, his coldness turned to cruelty, his words cutting sharper than any knife. And when Elisa gave birth to her third daughter, his cruelty transformed into violence. The snow had been falling outside the small cabin when Elisa labored to bring her third child into the world. It should have been a night of relief, of joy, of hope. Instead, Thomas's face darkened with a storm that mirrored the one raging beyond the cabin walls. His words lashed at her, words steeped in bitterness and disappointment, words that told her she had failed him once again. By the time the night was over, Elisa was too weak to resist when Thomas dragged her from the warmth of the cabin into the merciless cold. He tied her to a fence post at the far edge of the property, the ropes biting into her skin as he left her there with 3 helpless newborns at her side. "It is punishment," he told her. Punishment for failing him, punishment for failing to give him the son he believed he deserved. Hours passed. The wind tore at her thin dress, stripping away what little warmth she had left. Her fingers grew numb, stiff and unfeeling, while the snow clung to her lashes until the world itself became nothing but a blur of white and gray. Her body weakened, her spirit wavered, and yet, in the small, fragile cries of the 3 daughters who clung to life beside her, there was still something worth holding on to. And it was in that desolate moment, just as the silence of death began to press down upon her, that the sound of boots approached. The sound of salvation drawing near through the storm. Elisa tried to shield the babies with what little warmth her frail body still had, curling herself around them as best she could, though she could already feel their tiny forms cooling beneath her arms. The snow pressed against their delicate skin, and their cries, once sharp and pleading, had become no more than faint whimpers, thin threads of sound almost lost to the howling wind. Her body trembled with exhaustion, her lips cracked and blue, but even in her weakness she clung to the instinct of a mother desperate to protect her children against a world that had turned merciless. Miles away, in a lonely ranch house tucked against the tree-line, Samuel Burke lived a life of silence. A man in his early 40s, Samuel had long ago withdrawn from the world beyond his pastures. He spoke little, except to the animals he cared for or the restless wind that whistled through the tall pines. The war had claimed his family years before, carving grief so deeply into him that he built walls no one had been able to cross since. He had made peace with solitude, or at least convinced himself he had. But that morning, something unusual stirred within him. A strange pull, subtle yet insistent, urged him out into the snow to check the far fence line near the road, a place he seldom bothered with in winter. That was where he saw them. At first, the shape in the distance seemed no more than a trick of snow and shadow. But as his eyes adjusted, the truth struck him with the force of a hammer to the chest. A fragile figure bound to the fence, her head bowed forward, her dress stiff with frost, and 3 small bundles scattered in the snow at her side. For a heartbeat he could not move. Then the shock broke, and Samuel ran. The snow was deep, but he pounded through it with desperate strides, his boots hitting the frozen ground with a rhythm that matched the sudden racing of his heart. The closer he came, the more details seared into his vision. The rope biting into her bruised arms, the raw skin where the cord had cut too deep, her cracked lips trembling with breath too faint, and most haunting of all, the babies. Their cries had nearly faded into silence, their tiny fists limp, their skin pale with cold. Samuel did not stop to think. Instinct overpowered hesitation, and he dropped to his knees in the snow. His hands shook as he worked at the knots, cursing softly when the ropes resisted him, until at last the bindings gave way. He shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around the children, tucking them close to his chest, then gathered the woman into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, light as if the wind itself could have carried her away, and the realization filled him with a terrible dread. He tightened his grip and turned back toward his ranch. The journey was a battle against time and against the elements, each step harder than the last as the snow dragged at his legs and the bitter wind clawed at his face. But Samuel's resolve did not falter. He pressed forward, his arms locked around them, carrying not only bodies but lives that hung by a thread. When he reached the cabin, Samuel moved with the precision of a man who knew survival was now the only goal. He stoked the fire until it roared against the cold, filled the room with heat and light, then fetched every blanket he owned to wrap around the children and their mother. His hands, rough and calloused from years of work, moved gently as he checked their breathing, adjusted their blankets, rubbed life back into their cold limbs. He did not ask questions. Not then. There would be time later, when the danger had passed. For now, there was no space for anything but action, keeping the fire alive, keeping them warm, keeping them breathing. It was days before Elisa could speak. Her strength returned slowly, inch by inch, her body recovering from the ordeal even as her spirit bore the weight of it. When her voice finally rose above a whisper, she told him her story. Samuel listened in silence, his jaw tightening as each detail of her suffering spilled out. He had known loss in his own way, but nothing had prepared him for the cruelty she described, the betrayal of a husband who had cast her out, bound her in the snow, and left her and her children to die for no sin other than being daughters and not the son he demanded. Her words sank into Samuel's chest like iron, heavy and unshakable. He could not look at her and see someone who should be returned to such a life. No, the thought itself was unbearable. Elisa and her children had been discarded, cast aside as though they were nothing. But to Samuel, in that moment, they became everything. He would not send her back. When at last Elisa found the courage to ask what would become of her now, Samuel's answer came without hesitation. His voice was steady, quiet but resolute, carrying the weight of a promise he had not planned to make but knew he could never break. "You're coming with me," he said. Those 4 words settled something deep within her heart, a flicker of safety in a life that had known so little of it. Life on Samuel's ranch was not easy, but it was honest. The days were long and the work demanding, yet with every sunrise came the chance to begin again. In time, the ranch became more than a place of survival, it became a place of healing. The 3 little girls grew stronger with each passing season, their laughter echoing through the once silent rooms of Samuel's house, filling the spaces that had been haunted by loneliness for far too long. Their small footsteps pattered across wooden floors, their giggles danced in the air, and their presence slowly transformed the cabin from a shelter into a home. Elisa, though still carrying the scars of what she had endured, began to find her strength again. She learned the rhythm of the land, rising with the dawn to feed the animals, mending fences at Samuel's side, planting seeds that would bloom when spring returned. Her hands, once bound and bruised, now worked the soil and held her children close, and in those simple acts, she began to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. Samuel, for his part, had believed for years that his heart was too broken to love again. The war had taken his family, grief had hollowed him out, and silence had become his only companion. But as the months passed, he found himself smiling more easily, speaking more often, and dreaming of a future that no longer felt so empty. Where once there had been only loss, there was now laughter. Where once there had been only solitude, there was now hope. The town, of course, noticed. Whispers trailed them whenever they went into the market, hushed voices carrying judgment or curiosity. Some looked at Samuel with suspicion, others at Elisa with disdain, as though her past suffering marked her as less. But whispers have a way of shifting, and in time, they began to change. People saw the way Samuel stood protectively at her side, his quiet strength like an unspoken vow. They saw the way Elisa looked at him, her eyes filled not only with gratitude but with trust and the beginnings of something even deeper. And slowly, suspicion gave way to respect. What once had been gossip became reluctant admiration. Years later, on a winter evening when the snow fell gently outside, Samuel stood in the doorway of his cabin, watching the scene before him. The fire roared softly in the hearth, its glow casting a golden light across the room. Elisa sat by the flames, her face warm and serene as she helped the girls untangle strands of yarn for their sewing. The three daughters, no longer fragile infants but bright, lively children, chattered and laughed, their energy filling every corner of the home. Samuel leaned against the doorframe, his weathered hands resting against the wood, his eyes lingering on them with a quiet awe. In that moment, he realized something he had never thought possible. The family he believed he had lost to war, the love he thought was forever buried beneath grief, had, in its own unexpected way, been given back to him. Elisa had once been cast aside, punished for giving life to three daughters instead of a son. But in the warmth of Samuel's home, those daughters were no burden. They were blessings. They were proof that love, though scarred and battered, could survive the cruelty of the world. And as the snow fell softly against the windows, Samuel knew with absolute certainty that life had not ended in sorrow, but begun again in the unlikeliest of ways.